Between January and September 2024, copper inventories at the London Metal Exchange dropped by 267,000 metric tons. That's 71% of available stockpiles gone in 9 months. It's the lowest level since 1974. You know what else happened in 1974? Copper hit record highs and triggered a global recession because industries couldn't get the metal they needed to function. But here's what nobody's talking about. We're not running out of copper because of market forces. We're running out because the entire modern economy was built on a supply assumption that is physically impossible to maintain. Every electric vehicle needs 183 pounds of copper. Every wind turbine needs 4.7 tons. Every data center needs 5,000 tons per facility. And right now, we're consuming copper faster than new mines can possibly produce it. The deficit isn't coming. It's already here. And when the last warehouse empties, copper won't just get expensive. The grid will stop expanding. EVs will halt production. The energy transition will collapse. This isn't a commodity story. This is about what happens when the one metal that makes electricity work becomes unavailable at any price. Before we talk about the supply crisis, you need to understand why copper is different from every other commodity on Earth. Oil can be replaced with alternatives. Natural gas, nuclear, renewables. Steel can be substituted with aluminum, composites, engineered materials. Even silver has industrial alternatives for most applications. Copper cannot be replaced. Copper conducts electricity better than any metal except silver, and silver is 70 times more expensive. Every wire in your house is copper. Every transformer on every power line is copper. Every electric motor, every generator, every charging station, every server, every renewable energy system depends on copper. You cannot electrify civilization without copper. There is no substitute. There is no alternative. There is only copper, and we're running out. The world uses 25 million metric tons of copper annually. That number is accelerating. The International Energy Agency projects demand will hit 30 million tons by 2030 and 50 million tons by 2050. But here's the problem. We're not finding new copper deposits fast enough. The last major copper discovery that went into production was in 2014. Since then, global exploration budgets have been cut. Environmental permitting has slowed projects by a decade or more, and ore grades have been declining steadily. In the 1960s, a typical copper mine had ore grades of 1.5% copper. Today, new mines average 0.5% copper. That means you have to move 3 times as much rock to get the same amount of metal. Mining costs triple. Energy consumption triples. The economics barely work at current prices. And it takes 16 years on average to develop a new copper mine from discovery to production. Think about that. Even if we found a massive copper deposit today, it wouldn't produce a single pound of copper until 2041. By then, the deficit will have compounded for nearly 2 decades. Right now, we're bridging the gap with existing stockpiles. Warehouses, strategic reserves, inventory held by manufacturers. But those stockpiles are evaporating. The London Metal Exchange held 376,000 metric tons of copper in January 2024. By September, 109,000 tons. The Shanghai Futures Exchange dropped from 285,000 tons to 62,000 tons in the same period. This isn't normal market fluctuation. This is a structural shortage masked by dwindling reserves, and the demand acceleration hasn't even started yet. The electrification trap every government on Earth has committed to some version of decarbonization. Net zero by 2050. Carbon neutrality. Green New Deal. Energy transition. The language varies, but the goal is the same. Replace fossil fuels with electricity powered by renewables. This requires copper on a scale humanity has never attempted. A conventional gasoline car uses 50 pounds of copper in wiring, motors, and components. An electric vehicle uses 183 pounds, nearly 4 times as much. The International Copper Association estimates that converting the global vehicle fleet to EVs will require an additional 5 million metric tons of copper annually. That's 20% of current global production, just for cars. Wind turbines require 4.7 tons of copper per megawatt of capacity. Offshore turbines use even more. Solar farms need extensive copper wiring to connect panels to inverters to the grid. A single utility-scale solar installation can require 5 tons of copper per megawatt. The IEA projects that renewable energy installations will need to triple by 2030 to meet climate targets. Every wind farm, every solar array, every hydroelectric dam expansion requires copper. Then there's the grid itself. Right now, the U.S. electric grid moves about 4,000 terawatt-hours of electricity annually. Electrifying transportation, heating, and industrial processes could double or triple that number. Every new transmission line, every upgraded transformer, every charging station adds copper demand. A single EV fast charging station uses 500 pounds of copper. The U.S. will need 500,000 public charging stations by 2030. That's 125,000 tons of copper just for charging infrastructure. Data centers are another accelerating demand source. AI training facilities, cloud computing, cryptocurrency mining. A hyperscale data center uses 5,000 tons of copper in servers, cooling systems, and power distribution. Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Meta are all building dozens of new facilities. Each one is a permanent copper consumer. And here's the critical point. This demand is non-negotiable. Governments have mandated these transitions. The EU banned new gasoline car sales starting in 2035. California and New York followed. China is subsidizing EV production at unprecedented scale. These policies create copper demand that cannot be reduced without abandoning climate commitments entirely. We've built a future that requires copper we don't have. The mining math doesn't work. Let's do the math on what it would take to meet projected demand. Current global copper production, 25 million metric tons per year. Projected demand by 2030, 30 million metric tons. That's a 5 million ton shortfall. To close that gap, we'd need the equivalent of 10 new world-class copper mines coming online by 2030. How many are under construction right now? 3. And those 3 are facing delays. Environmental challenges, permitting issues, capital shortages, political instability in mining regions. The Kamoa-Kakula mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo is one of the largest new projects. It's also in a country where mining operations regularly face armed conflict, corruption, and infrastructure failures. But even if all 3 projects deliver on schedule, they'll produce maybe 1.5 million tons combined. That still leaves a 3.5 million ton deficit. The problem isn't just finding copper, it's extracting it economically. Copper deposits are formed by geological processes that take millions of years. Magma intrusions, hydrothermal fluids, tectonic shifts. The largest deposits on Earth were formed 50 to 200 million years ago. We've already mined the easiest, richest deposits. What's left are lower-grade ores in more remote locations, often at higher elevations, with worse infrastructure, and in jurisdictions with unstable governments. Mining copper at 0.3% or grade in the Andes at 15,000 feet elevation, in a country with a history of nationalizing mines, is a very different proposition than mining 1.5% ore grade in Arizona, with highway access and stable property rights. The economics only work if copper prices rise substantially. But if copper prices rise too much, industries that depend on copper become unprofitable. It's a trap. Recycling won't save us either. About 30% of global copper supply comes from recycled material. That sounds significant until you realize that most copper products have 30 to 50-year lifespans. The copper in a building's wiring installed in 2000 would and be available for recycling until 2040. The copper in infrastructure built during the post-war boom of the 1950s and 60s is being recycled now. But there's no equivalent inventory coming behind it. We can't recycle copper that hasn't been mined yet. And even with maximum recycling efforts, the IEA estimates recycled copper will only meet 20% of demand by 2050. The other 80% has to come from primary mining, which brings us back to the same problem. We need 10 to 15 major new copper mines to come online every decade for the next 30 years. We're currently on track for maybe 3. The manipulation nobody talks about, here's where it gets darker. The copper market, like silver, is heavily influenced by paper trading. Futures, contracts, derivatives, ETFs. The London Metal Exchange trades copper futures representing 5 times the annual global production. Most of those contracts are settled in cash, not physical delivery. As long as the paper market functions, prices stay disconnected from physical reality. Traders bet on prices without ever touching metal. Banks create synthetic exposure through derivatives. The market looks liquid and functional till someone demands delivery. In March 2021, a Chinese copper trader named Haiding Su took delivery of 90,000 tons of copper from LME warehouses. That's not unusual. What was unusual is that Su kept taking delivery month after month, draining warehouses. By December 2021, LME copper inventories had dropped to 72,000 tons, the lowest in 47 years. The exchange panicked. They raised delivery requirements. They pressured warehouse operators. They changed rules to prevent further withdrawals. But the damage was done. Everyone saw that the supposedly massive copper stockpiles were a fiction. The metal wasn't there. Prices spiked from $9,000 per ton to $10,700 in weeks. Then, mysteriously, inventory started flowing back. Su's positions were quietly unwound. Warehouses restocked. The crisis disappeared from headlines. But the lesson remained. The paper market works only as long as nobody demands the physical metal. When delivery is required, the system breaks. And now we're seeing the same pattern on a larger scale. China imported 5.9 million tons of copper in 2023. That's 24% of global mine production going to one country. China isn't importing for immediate consumption, they're stockpiling. The Chinese State Reserve Bureau has been building strategic copper reserves for over a decade. They understand that copper is a choke point for industrial capacity. If you control copper, you control electrification. You control manufacturing. You control the energy transition. The U.S. has no strategic copper reserve. Europe has minimal stockpiles. Western nations sold off strategic inventories in the 1990s and 2000s, assuming global markets would always provide supply. That assumption is being tested right now. The historical pattern: this has happened before. In 1974, copper prices spiked 130% in a single year. Supply constraints from strikes, political instability in Chile, and surging demand created a shortage. Industries couldn't get copper. Construction projects halted. Electronics manufacturing slowed. The shortage contributed to the 1974-1975 recession. Governments responded by releasing strategic stockpiles and pressuring mines to increase production. Prices stabilized. The crisis passed. But the 1974 shortage was temporary. Mines ramped up. Demand moderated. Supply caught up. This time, the shortage isn't temporary. It's structural. We're not facing a supply disruption. We're facing a permanent demand acceleration that exceeds the planet's ability to produce copper fast enough. In 2007-2008, copper hit $8,900 per ton as China's infrastructure boom consumed global supply. Miners responded by opening new projects. By 2011, supply had increased and prices stabilized, but those projects took 4 to 7 years to come online. And they were the last generation of high-grade deposits. Everything discovered since then has been lower grade, more expensive, harder to develop. The next shortage won't be resolved by new mines because there aren't enough new mines coming. The green energy paradox. Here's the paradox nobody wants to acknowledge. The energy transition requires copper, but mining copper is energy intensive. A typical copper mine consumes 50 to 100 megawatts of continuous power. That's the equivalent of powering 50,000 homes. Crushing, grinding, extracting, and refining copper requires massive amounts of electricity. If that electricity comes from fossil fuels, then mining copper for renewable energy is just moving emissions upstream. If it comes from renewables, then you're using copper to mine copper, creating a circular dependency that barely pencils out energetically. The energy return on energy invested for copper mining has been declining for decades. In the 1950s, you could extract 50 units of copper for every unit of energy input. Today, it's closer to 10 to 1. By 2050, it might be 5 to 1 for new mines. At some point, it takes more energy to mine copper than the copper enables in energy systems. That's the thermodynamic wall. We're not there yet, but we're approaching it. When supply shrinks, prices spike. When prices spike, industries relying on copper collapse. It's a feedback loop with no exit. What's happening right now? The LME copper inventory on January 1, 2024, 376,000 metric tons. As of October 2024, 98,000 metric tons. That's a 74% drawdown in 10 months. The Shanghai Futures Exchange held 285,000 tons in January. By September, 62,000 tons, a 78% decline. Global visible copper inventories, the metal tracked in exchange warehouses. If every warehouse emptied and no new copper arrived, the world would run out in 72 hours. Manufacturers are already feeling the squeeze. Lead times for copper wire have extended from 4 weeks to 12 weeks. Premiums, the amount buyers pay above the LME price for physical delivery, have spiked from $80 per ton to $350 per ton in some markets. The market is screaming that physical supply is gone. And it's not just warehouses. Mines are struggling. Peru, the second largest producer, faces political instability and community opposition to mining. The Democratic Republic of Congo has vast copper reserves but chronic infrastructure and governance problems. Cobalt is mined alongside copper there, and the human rights issues are severe enough that many Western companies avoid Congolese supply chains entirely. In the U.S., the only major new copper project is the Resolution mine in Arizona. China recognized this decades ago. They acquired stakes in Peruvian mines, Congolese mines, Australian mines. They built refining capacity. They secured long-term supply contracts. They process ore from around the world, turn it into usable copper, and then decide who gets it. This isn't a free market. This is strategic resource control. If geopolitical tensions escalate, if Taiwan gets invaded, if trade wars intensify, China could restrict copper exports. Not officially. They just slow refining, delay shipments, prioritize domestic consumption. Western nations would face immediate shortages. Manufacturing would halt. The grid expansion would stop. EV production would collapse. The demand side that can't be cut when oil prices spike, people drive less. Copper demand is not flexible. The motors require specific windings. The battery systems need specific cabling. It's engineered to precise specifications. If you're building a wind turbine, you need 4.7 tons of copper. You'd need 64% more aluminum by volume to carry the same current. The turbine would be heavier, more expensive, and structurally unsound. Aluminum transformers exist, but they're larger, less efficient, and have shorter lifespans. You cannot reduce copper intensity without abandoning electrification entirely, and no government is willing to do that. The three phases of collapse when commodities enter terminal shortage. The collapse happens in three phases. Phase 1. Rising prices with available supply. Copper is expensive, but if you pay the premium, you can still get it. Manufacturers complain. Projects get delayed, but the system functions. We're in Phase 1 right now. Phase 2. Spot shortages and delivery failures. Prices spike suddenly. Contracts get broken. Manufacturers can't source copper even at elevated prices. They halt production lines. Layoffs start. Governments intervene with price controls, rationing, export restrictions. This phase could begin within 18 to 24 months. Phase 3. Systemic collapse. Copper is unavailable at any price. The paper market freezes. Futures contracts default. ETFs suspend redemptions. Physical copper trades in black markets at 5 to 10 times official prices. The grid stops expanding. Renewable energy projects die. The energy transition collapses. This is the endgame, and it's not a matter of if, but when. The Hunt brothers exposed this pattern with silver in 1980. When physical delivery is demanded and supply doesn't exist, the paper market implodes. The copper is 100 times larger than the silver market. The implosion will be proportionally catastrophic. What the experts won't say, there are people who understand this. Mining executives, commodity traders, government officials. They know the math. They know the deficit is coming. They won't say it publicly because acknowledging the shortage creates panic. If manufacturers knew copper would be unavailable in 3 years, they'd hoard now, accelerating the shortage. If governments admitted the energy transition is unachievable without copper, political commitments would unravel. If investors realized copper scarcity was inevitable, prices would spike immediately, destroying industries. So the system pretends everything is fine. The LME reports inventory numbers as if 98,000 tons is a functional stockpile. Governments announce renewable energy targets as if the copper exists to build them. Manufacturers plan production schedules as if supply chains will hold. But behind closed doors, the scramble is happening. China stockpiling. Chile restricting exports. Mining companies rejecting low-price contracts. Refiners prioritizing domestic customers. The market is fragmenting. Copper is being allocated politically, not economically. And when allocation becomes political, shortages become permanent. The renewable energy mirage. The hardest truth is this: the renewable energy transition as currently planned is physically impossible. Not because the technology doesn't work, not because the economics don't pencil, but because the material inputs don't exist. Wind, solar, batteries, EVs, grid upgrades. All of it requires copper. The IEA estimates the energy transition will need 10 million additional tons of copper annually by 2050. We're currently producing 25 million tons total. We need to increase production by 40%, but we're not increasing production. We're struggling to maintain it. Even if every planned mine comes online on schedule, even if recycling doubles, even if demand grows slower than projected, we still face a multi-million-ton annual deficit. Governments have two choices: abandon decarbonization targets or admit that electrification will be slower, more expensive, and more limited than promised. Neither option is politically viable. So they'll pretend the problem doesn't exist until the shortages force a reckoning. When that happens, the energy transition won't be a policy choice. It'll be a resource-constrained reality. The coming price shock: copper prices are currently around $9,500 per metric ton. That's historically elevated, but not extreme. Goldman Sachs projects copper could hit $15,000 by 2025 if supply constraints worsen. Bank of America thinks $20,000 by 2026 is possible. But those projections assume normal market dynamics. They assume mines will ramp up, demand will moderate, and the paper market will hold. If the paper market breaks, if futures default, if physical delivery becomes impossible, copper doesn't go to $20,000. It goes to $50,000, or $100,000, or it becomes unavailable at any price because the physical metal is allocated through government channels, not markets. This isn't speculation, it's pattern recognition. In 2007, rhodium, a rare metal used in catalytic converters, went from $2,000 per ounce to $10,000 in 2 years because automotive demand exceeded mining capacity. In 2021, lumber prices spiked 400% when supply chains broke and housing demand surged. Builders couldn't get material. Projects halted. In 2022, nickel prices exploded 250% in 2 days on the LME when a Chinese trader could undeliver physical metal and faced a margin call. The exchange suspended trading. Copper is bigger than all of these. The price shock will be larger, longer, and more destructive. Why physical copper is different from paper? Here's the critical distinction. You can own copper exposure through ETFs like COPX or CPER. You can trade futures on the LME. You can buy shares in mining companies. But none of that gives you physical copper. If the paper market collapses, your ETF shares are worth whatever the liquidation value is after lawsuits and defaults. Your futures contracts settle for cash at a manipulated price. Nations with domestic copper production will have strategic advantages. Chile, Peru, the US, Australia, China. Countries dependent on imports will face energy poverty. industrial decline, and economic stagnation. Europe has almost no copper production. They import everything. If supply tightens, European manufacturers will be the first to lose access. The continent's industrial base will hollow out further. Japan and South Korea are entirely import-dependent. Their electronics industries, automotive sectors, and infrastructure depend on copper they don't produce. Supply disruptions would be catastrophic. Africa has massive untapped copper reserves, but lacks the capital infrastructure and stability to develop them quickly. China has been investing heavily in African copper mines for this reason. When scarcity hits, China will control supply chains from mine to refinery to end user. The U.S. has copper deposits, but environmental regulations, permitting delays, and community opposition have blocked development for decades. The Resolution mine in Arizona has faced 13 years of legal challenges. The Pebble mine in Alaska was blocked outright despite containing billions of pounds of copper. If copper scarcity becomes a national security issue, those regulations will get waived. But by then, it'll be too late. The deficit will already be entrenched. Resource wars have historically been fought over oil. The next generation will be fought over copper. This isn't about trading copper futures for profit. This isn't investment advice. This is about understanding that the material foundation of modern civilization is eroding in real time. Every financial system, every government, every corporation assumes that materials will be available when needed. That assumption is breaking. Copper is the warning signal everyone is ignoring. When the shortage hits, when manufacturers can't get copper, when the grid stops expanding, when EV production halts, when renewable energy projects collapse, people will ask why nobody saw it coming. But the data is already here. The warehouse drawdowns, the mine closures, the demand acceleration, the geopolitical stockpiling. The pattern is obvious. The Hunt brothers tried to expose silver manipulation in 1980. They were destroyed for it, but they were right. The paper market was a fraud. Physical supply was gone. 45 years later, the same dynamic is playing out with copper. Except this time, it's not two billionaires against the system. It's physics against policy. You cannot electrify the world without copper. You cannot mine copper fast enough to meet demand. You cannot print copper into existence. The gap is widening every month. For 74 days in 2024, copper inventories dropped 74%. That's not a market cycle. That's a structural collapse beginning in slow motion. The people who understand this are acting quietly. China stockpiling. Manufacturers locking in multi-year contracts. Sovereign funds buying mining equity. By the time the shortage becomes undeniable, the physical copper will be gone. Not expensive, gone. The pattern has played out before with every resource where paper claims exceeded physical supply. Oil in 1973, gold in 1971, silver in 1980, rhodium in 2008. Every time, the paper market collapsed. Every time, physical holders won. The window to act is closing. Not because someone is telling you to buy, but because the math is telling you that what comes next is inevitable. When Phase 3 hits, when copper is unavailable at any price, the energy transition will be exposed as the material impossibility it always was. And the world that was promised, renewable, electrified, decarbonized, will remain a fantasy built on a commodity that ran out while everyone was watching the paper price instead of the physical metal. The choice is simple. Understand the pattern now, or learn it later when there's nothing left to do.